Hi, ladies. This week we're going to be talking about chapter 9 and 10 from the textbook. And so the first chapter, chapter 9, talks about a couple of different important people, one of whom is St. Anthony of Egypt. And just to remind you of some things that you would have already read, first of all, that there are Christian persecutions happening. The different people who are emperors are treating the Christians in different ways depending on who they are. Some of them were very terrible to the Christians, some of them weren't. And so Christianity basically went underground and people had to practice their faith privately. Also, the big cities were pretty chaotic. There was a lot of barbarian invasions, meaning just different groups of people that were trying to attack and take over parts of the Roman Empire. And so some people really wanted to get away from the craziness and chaos of it and just focus on prayer. One of those people is someone named St. Anthony of Egypt. St. Anthony went into the desert and lived like a hermit, and other people were doing that, but in his case, his purpose for it was so that he could pray and focus on God. And so St. Athanasius tells us about his life story in a biography. But basically, St. Anthony became kind of well known for his devoted, prayer life. He was very ascetical, meaning that he was practiced a lot of self-denial, very routine, and didn't eat a lot, didn't sleep a lot, but spent a lot of time in prayer. And so other people started to follow suit, meaning that they kind of moved where they could sort of observe what he was doing, but still be on their own. And eventually they kind of put a wall around it, and eventually this became known as a monastery. And so a monastery was for monks, and the monks, some of which were priests, were able to focus on study and prayer, and they lived a very ascetical lifestyle, meaning that they denied themselves a lot of basic necessities like sleep and food and drink, and instead focused on prayer. And so that was kind of something that was happening. It started to happen in a lot of the rural areas. Also in 313 AD, a big thing that happened was Constantine came in and took over. Like there was a battle, and he overthrew the leader who was in the western part of the Roman Empire. At this point, the Roman Empire was so large that they had a leader in the west and a leader in the east. And so he overtook the western person and became the leader in the west. And the person in the east, his name was Licinius. And so this happened in 313 AD. And Constantine, before his battle where he won this position, he had this image or this dream of putting the Chi symbol on his shield. The Chi symbol is like a P with an X through it, and this was a symbol for Christianity. His mother was a Christian. Anyway, so he told everyone in his army to paint that on their shield, and then they did, and they, of course, won the battle. So he partnered with Licinius, and together they wrote something called the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan was a decree making it legal for everyone to practice their faith publicly. So Christians no longer had to do this in hiding, and they could publicly worship. And it not only allowed them the ability to have a public faith, but he also showed a lot of preference toward Christians. And so the Christian faith became very common, which I think is good and bad. I mean, obviously it was good because it ended the persecutions, but it could technically be a little bit bad because it became kind of the norm, and so people were becoming Christian because some of the perks that Constantine initiated instead of because they were faith-filled. But it did totally change the experience for Christians at the time. Also, Constantine kind of put himself as the head of the church, which is called Caesaropapism. And one thing that he did is he called church councils. And so essentially what would happen is there would be a group of people preaching something slightly different than what the normal Christian preacher was saying. Mostly about the nature of Jesus, whereas one person was saying Jesus is fully human and fully divine, and the other person is saying Jesus looked divine but was fully human. Jesus was just a spirit. Jesus was like a demigod. Jesus was neither divine or human. It kind of ran the gamut. And so they would call a church council to discuss this, and when they decided on what the official teaching was, they would declare anyone who wasn't teaching that a heretic, and they're teaching a heresy. So all of the early church councils met to address different heresies. And Constantine called one in Nicaea, and the Nicene Council sat down and wrote what's called the Nicene Creed. They wrote a rough draft of it. It continued to be kind of tweaked at the next few councils. But that was a statement of belief, and it was really important to get that in writing so that they could combat all of these false teachings. Chapter 10 talks about St. Augustine. St. Augustine is an incredibly important theologian and person in the church. But St. Augustine was not Christian in the beginning. He had a mother who was a Christian. Her name was Monica. I mentioned Constantine's mother who was a Christian. And so you see this kind of reoccurring theme. His mother's name was Helen, but St. Augustine's mother was Monica. And anyway, Monica really tried to convert St. Augustine. And as many of us do sometimes, we try to do the opposite of what our mothers want. And so he tried different things. He tried this religion called Manichaeism. They basically taught that there were two gods, like a good God and an evil God. And anyway, his mother just really nagged him about it. And so one day, according to St. Augustine himself, he was sitting in a park and he heard these children chanting, "Take and read, take and read." And so he decided that was kind of a sign from God, and so that he should take and read the Bible. So he gave himself 1 year, basically read the Bible, go to Mass, practice this faith his mother keeps talking about. Meanwhile, his mom really was praying fervently for his conversion. And it worked. So he converted to Christianity. He realized up until this point he was a partier. He slept with lots of different women. He lived with one woman he wasn't married to. She got pregnant. They had a child out of wedlock. And so when he converted, he really felt like the real stumbling block for him was sex and his sexuality. So he was very kind of negative in his writings about sex. He wrote two big things. One is called the Confessions, which is exactly what it sounds like. He confesses all of his sins. And one great line from the Confessions is, he says, "I was restless until I rested in you." So he basically describes all of this searching that he did early in his life as being fulfilled once he found Jesus. So St. Augustine converted, became a priest and a bishop in Africa. And so as a bishop, he was very vocal against two different heretical groups. One of them that you'll read about are the Donatists. And the Donatists were basically people who believed that during the persecutions, if someone denounced their faith and, kind of said they didn't believe in Jesus just to save their lives, but then once it became legal, wanted to be members of the church again, they were really opposed to that. But in particular, they had an issue with any priest who had done that. And so they basically said that if a priest does something sinful, then any sacrament or any ritual that they perform is invalid. And St. Augustine just totally disagreed with them and said that Jesus is working through the priest, that they just have to have good intentions, but they don't have to be sinless. So that was the big argument with the Donatists. The Pelagians, on the other hand, were the second group, and the Pelagians believed that a person didn't really need God's grace to get into heaven. And so grace was something that St. Augustine talked about a lot. And grace is kind of this free gift that's given to us by God. But we need it in our lives. We need it to be saved. We need it to go to heaven. And that was all according to St. Augustine. So you'll read about him and his arguments with these groups in chapter 10. This week you're doing a discussion. So again, post your original comment by 11:55 a.m. on Tuesday. Comment on someone else by Thursday. And then you'll take quiz number 2 this week. And quiz number 2 is exactly the same format as quiz number 1 with the same number of questions. If you have any questions, let me know. Also, just for the record, eventually you're going to write a research paper, so you should start thinking about what you'd like the topic for that research paper to be. It can be, any person that you want to write about, that you want to nominate as sort of the most important person or event in church history. It can be anything that is talked about in the book. And prior to the actual due date of the research paper, you will turn in an outline and a works cited page. If you go to the week the outline is due in the modules, you'll see a couple samples of the outlines. These outlines will be keyword outlines. They don't need to be sentence outlines, but they should outline what your paper will talk about. And remember, when you're doing an outline, that anytime there's an A, there has to be a B. If there's a 1, there has to be a 2. So review kind of the basic outlining rules that you should have learned in high school. If you do have any questions, let me know. And that's not due for a little bit, but you should start thinking about what you'd like to write about. Have a great week. Try to stay warm.